without further ado, I'll let you guys take it away and let everyone know what today is about.
Cool. Well, we're going to do a 30-minute roundup of the news, Terry and myself, and hopefully if we've got a bit of time at the end, we'll open up to some questions, if anyone's got any questions relating to the articles we're going to talk about. So guess we just kick off. And the first thing we're going to talk about, obviously, is the really big news, which is the imminent launch from US soil of the SpaceX NASA Demo 2 mission. Terry, what's your take on this?
Well, it seems ages since there was an American launch, although, as we're going to talk about a little bit, the Virgin did a launch which didn't go into orbit, but this is basically the big stuff. This is the heavy league, getting stuff into orbit and docking with the ISS. And the Americans, of course, have been totally reliant on Russia since 2011 to get their crew up there, cost of $85 million per flight. So that's something to take into account too. But the main thing is basically that America has been almost on the sidelines as far as human space launch has been concerned for the last almost a decade. And it would be, I would say, almost embarrassing for them. So this, if it succeeds, and we obviously hope it will, is basically getting them back in the game.
It's quite amazing as well that Doug was one of the people who was the last people to fly the space shuttle. Obviously, the space shuttle was retired, as you said, about a decade ago now, and Virgin Galactic has been the only launch anywhere near space with VSS Unity in the last few years. From US soil anyway, with their launch with the White Knight. It's between, I mean, Doug and Bob as well, the two astronauts. I mean, they're both married to astronauts. So whilst this is a risky flight, it's obviously been tested. The SpaceX Dragon capsule has got a lot of heritage. SpaceX aren't averse to the odd failure, mind you, and everyone's obviously keeping the fingers crossed that nothing goes wrong for this launch tomorrow. I found it really funny that unlike the shuttle launches and obviously in the Apollo launches, the trip from the pad or to the pad from the suit room, instead of being in the Astrovan, is going to be in a Tesla, which is pretty typical of Elon and is kind of is one to kind of show off, as it were, in some respects. But it's going to be interesting. And as you said, they have still booked flights on Soyuz as a kind of fallback just in case. But this hopefully will be a return, along with things like CST Starliner, to fully American launches.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if this doesn't go ahead for whatever reason, it could be just technical faults, it could be a delay for whatever reason, software, whatever. But yes, they do still need to have a means of getting crew up and down to the ISS. And if they get up, they'll be increasing the number of crew by an extra 2, bringing it up to 5. How long they stay there is another interesting matter. It depends basically on how the mission goes. They'll be testing everything, obviously, during the actual flight itself. It's called a Demo 2, so it's still basically a demonstration flight, and they only have 2 on board. So they can stay for between 1 month and 4 months, apparently, and they'll be checking everything. And a lot also depends on when the crew for the next launch by Elon Musk, not the Crew Dragon, but their actual first operational mission. If it's ready to go, then they can bring this crew down. So there's a lot riding on this.
There is, yeah. And August is the kind of scheduled date for the next launch. And as you said, they can go up to 4 months. And that's principally down to the solar panel design from all accounts.
Yeah, 190 days.
Yeah, degradation on the solar panels, which would be, again, quite interesting to see and watch that. I mean, some of the things with this capsule, it's very sleek design. The interior of it really looks like something out of 2001. The one thing that has come up, and I know I've brought it up on social media and a few other people, is the suit design. Yeah, it's quite an interesting futuristic look at kind of suit design, which almost reminded me of the pop group Devo meets the Power Rangers at one point. I don't know what your thoughts on it, Terry. I know that the suit designer, Jose Fernandez, is the person who did a lot of film suit design work and costume design, especially films like Wonder Woman. So I'm just wondering what everybody in the audience, if anyone wants to comment in the audience in the chat further, ask some questions, thinks about the suits. I'm not particularly partial to them. I love the old Apollo A7 suits. They're huge, bulky, but obviously not suitable for this kind of mission. Even the pumpkin suits from the shuttle era I thought were really nice. the suit from The Martian, if you wanted to go film direction,
Yeah.
it would have been the optimal suit in terms of something that was light, comfortable, and looked really good. It's more the aesthetic. I'm guessing the practicality, it's great, but the aesthetic on it, to me, leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah, Nick, I'm afraid I'm not a dedicated follower of fashion. As long as the thing works and it's safe, within reason, I don't mind how it looks.
Yeah, it's funny. I know somebody who worked on some of the. I know several people who worked at ILC Dover, and a wonderful lady called Jean Wright as well, who sets a group, part of a group called the Sew Sisters, and she worked on a lot of the suit work. I'd just be really interested to see what people who've worked on the suits really think of these new designs. But yeah, it's going to be an exciting mission. What I could say to everyone in Florida: please don't go. There is still a global pandemic. It is still deadly. It is still killing people all over the world. Despite the fact that this is the first major launch from US soil, first launch from the Cape in a decade, everybody's saying, please don't go. NASA is saying, please don't go. If you are in Florida, watch it from your backyard, from the safety of somewhere. Or if you're anywhere else in the world, obviously just watch it online. But please, 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 please don't go crowding Cocoa Beach or any of the other potential launch locations that people normally go to, because you could potentially end up this being your first and last launch that you see. So that's my only bit of safety advice on top of that. If you've got any any concluding comments on this, Terry?
No, I totally agree. You know, you can see, probably get a better view on your screen than you will live, although you don't experience it and you don't feel the vibration and the noise that goes through you. But yeah, you'll get a better view by watching it live on whatever platform you want. There's one other thing that we need to bear in mind in this. Apollo and the shuttle were designed purely for getting people to the into space and the ISS, and Apollo obviously to go to the moon. Elon is thinking of this in commercial terms as well, because it will be open for people to actually book tourist flights. I don't think the price has been announced yet. But he's looking much more further than just getting people up and down to the ISS. So it's interesting that the private enterprise really is opening up this a lot more than NASA ever would. NASA would never consider bringing people into space just because they have enough money to do it. But Musk is a commercial enterprise, basically. And that's one of the things to look forward to, assuming everything is successful. Not that I have enough money to book a flight.
Well, you say look forward to. I mean, the thing with Doug, and you know, obviously having flown the shuttle, he'll have been used to the almost luxurious re-entry of a space shuttle landing, which was obviously a bumpy ride. But compared to an Apollo command module coming back in at, you know, potentially up to 24,000 miles an hour, or these things coming in at, you know, 10 to 12,000 miles an hour and pulling huge G-forces, it's not going to be, and then splash down in the ocean potentially. And as Doug said during one of his press conferences, that he's looking forward to feeling sick, because that's a common one, that they, you know, they go up and they, you know, just get used to gravity again, and then they're being tossed about in the ocean for a while. So I wouldn't possibly recommend this as an ideal or optimal way to enjoy spaceflight. I mean, getting up on the ISS would be great, but those G-forces coming down, and obviously if anything was anomalous and you had to do the launch escape mechanism, you're going to be pulling staggering G-forces on that as well. So it won't be something that you can just rock up to SpaceX on like the Thursday and launch on the Sunday after a couple of days of experience of training. Anyway, so on to our next. Oh, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, maybe move on to our next news item. So if you can pull up the next slide.
Yeah, that's it.
Cool. Right, let me just have a look on my screen. So basically next up, we're going to be talking about the Russian launch. That correct? Sorry,
We've got the Boeing Starliner.
Oh, Boeing is well. This is the other. This is the other thing in the competition. Sorry, I've got notes here, and they're not tying up with what I'm seeing on the screen. We had a few technical problems earlier on with the presentation, but Boeing Starliner, yeah, that's an interesting one. Boeing have obviously had a raft of problems over the past few years. Doug Loverro, recently resigning as head of human spaceflight at NASA, seems to be linked into the procurement for the Artemis landers. Which is another kind of aside from this and potentially related to Boeing. nothing's been obviously formally announced or confirmed. There was an article on IRS Technica talking about this a few days ago. Again, what's your feeling on this, Terry, in terms of where Boeing are heading at the moment? Because obviously they've got issues with the 737 MAX. They've had issues with SLS, massive overruns on that. Starliner didn't work with its first demo. So,
Yeah, Boeing, of course, have been in the space game for a long time, involved in various aspects with NASA, whereas Musk has come into it just totally from the outside of his own initiative. The one big difference, of course, with the Boeing Starliner is that it comes down for a soft landing on land rather than splashing down in the ocean with a combination of parachutes and big airbags. And they have actually, although their first flight didn't make it to the correct orbit to dock with the ISS, they did get it back down for a very successful landing. And I have mixed feelings about whether I would like to be on something that's going to come down on land or come down on sea. If the airbags don't inflate, you're only coming down under parachutes, and it's going to be a nasty bump. On the other hand, if you're coming down in a rough sea, or one of the parachutes doesn't open, you're still going to hit the water pretty hard. So I've mixed feelings, but there's something very satisfying, I think, about leaving from land and coming back on land.
There is. I mean, you say about the kind of parachute failure. That obviously happened with Apollo 15, and they made it back quite, safe and sound, as it were.
Yeah.
Obviously, with the Soyuz, you've got that last second burn, which decelerates the returning capsule before it hits the ground, but they still hit with quite a jolt. I mean, they liken it, some of the astronauts I've talked to about this have likened it to being in a 20, 30 mile an hour car crash, which is no fun if anyone's ever been in one. The thing about, I think the aesthetics on Starliner are quite nice. They do remind me of the Apollo command module in many respects. It'd be good to see the options. I mean, that's the thing I'd like to take from it. And Boeing, no, you don't wish them any ill at all. They've put in an inordinate amount of work. They've done great work over the entire history of spaceflight practically. So it would be good to see. But moving on to that kind of next slide with what I was saying about Doug, there were all sorts of rumors around this as to whether or not it had anything to do with this mission. And it turns out it is absolutely nothing to do with it. It is down to the Artemis procurement. So obviously you've got 3 different teams now kind of vying for the lunar lander contracts, and 3 very, very different design propositions being put forward. We touched a bit upon this during our Mars talk the other week, but interesting to see how that progresses and whether or not any of them will hit these deadlines. Obviously, if there's a launch anomaly tomorrow, if there's any kind of potential failure, you only have to look at what happened with Columbia and Challenger and how that set back the US space program by several years in both cases. So it'd be interesting to see if that happens. And obviously, we don't want to see anything happening bad to the astronauts, but if there was any kind of anomaly that did put them back, what that would do to the overall timescale for the potential lunar landings.
Yeah, it's hard to even sort of contemplate that scenario, although being realistic, after what happened with, first of all, Apollo 1 on the ground, on the launch pad, and secondly with both Challenger and Columbia and some of the accidents that the Russians have had over the years, which we don't know quite so much about, it is a risky business. They do have the backup still, as you say, of the Russian launches via the Soyuz. But Boeing, I think, are due to do their first flight before the end of the year, which will be quite independent of whether the Elon Musk launch is successful or not.
Yeah, and I just think it'd be really good. The press conference earlier today where Jim Bridenstine was talking about the various options and the astronauts were talking about all the options. I think it's a really unique time in US space history now that they have so many different launch vehicles and docking vehicles being prepared. You've got Dream Chaser as well on the cards. There's a whole raft of them coming on or actually on stream already. So it's a good time to be interested in space. It feels almost like the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo era starting again, but in a commercial sense.
Yeah, it's almost like an internal space race. Instead of between America and Russia, you have it between SpaceX and Boeing. And there are pros and cons in that. Obviously, you don't want to rush anything to the point of view of risking safety. On the other hand, there's kudos to be first.
Absolutely. So on to our next article, we're going to kind of touch here now a bit more on the astronomy side, because obviously we've both got a bit of an astronomy background as well. We're coming up on Noctilucent Cloud season. Now, these are beautiful, and it's one of those great things that anyone, you don't need a telescope, you don't need any fancy equipment. You can literally just go out in your back garden and see them. And I know you're a big fan of these, Terry.
Yes, indeed. I'm reasonably far north. I think I'm a bit, maybe 1.5 degrees further north than you are, which is both good and bad in terms of the amount of summer twilight that we get. But yes, as you say, you can see them everywhere, and it doesn't matter too much about light pollution unless it's very, very bad, because you're seeing them in the summer twilight. You're seeing them while the sun hasn't completely dipped so far below the horizon that the sky gets totally dark. And that's why they're called Noctilucent Clouds, which means night shining. They shine at night, but not in total darkness. And what's happening basically, if you can see in that photograph, the lower clouds, what we call tropospheric clouds, which go up to about a height of maybe 6-7 miles in our atmosphere, they are not illuminated by the sun, which is why they are dark. In other words, the sun is too far below the horizon to shine on those ones. But the Noctilucent Clouds are 60, 70, 80 miles up, and the sun, having not dipped too far below the horizon, is illuminating them. And clouds, okay, so what? Surely they're the bane of any astronomer's life, which is true, but these ones actually are astronomical in origin. They are caused by the fine dust which originates in the upper atmosphere whenever meteors burn up as they first enter our atmosphere. So you're looking at basically a sort of the debris of billions, probably, of meteors that burn up high in our atmosphere, and we never even see them. So that's what the Noctilucent Clouds are. And go out and look. You're not visible every night, but basically when the sky is so dark that you can just start to see the very brightest stars like Capella, then you can look for them. And you see them if the sky's clear, probably about one night in a dozen or so, something like that.
If you are lucky enough to have a half decent camera that can take time-lapse images,
yeah,
it's well worth setting that up on a tripod and just continually shooting for several hours once you start to see them, because they do move and they can create some absolutely fascinating and truly beautiful displays. The one thing I will say, obviously, light pollution is an issue, but in terms of the overall pollution that the planet's undergoing at the moment due to the reduction in air travel and reduction in traffic, you will actually probably be able to see something a little bit better lower down in terms of latitude, not your latitude, but in terms of relative to the sky position, because normally when you're looking low across the horizon, a lot of the sky can be kind of blanked out by pollution, dust, whatever. Obviously right now, this unique situation that we're in, potentially you could see it could be a really fantastic display this year.
Yeah. I didn't point out actually, but for those that don't know, you look north basically, which is where the sun is as it's dipping below the northern horizon at this time of year. It's setting basically in the northwest, dips down below the northern horizon at its lowest point, and then moves around and starts to rise in the northeast. And that's where you see these clouds. I always look for Capella, which is one of the brightest stars in the sky, and it's usually more or less visible in the center of the Noctilucent Clouds from where I am. And I think for most people in the UK or Ireland, that's where you look. And they're beautiful. There was sort of a silvery, ethereal look about them. They're quite unlike any other clouds that you see.
And the thing is, as well, Terry was saying about Capella, around about 11 o'clock at night at this time of year, it starts to go kind of really dusky, dark. So about 10:30 till maybe 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, if you want to stay up late, is a really good time. People obviously see them throughout the night, and you can see them approaching dawn as well. But if you don't want to stay up all night, it's worth having a look after the sunset, maybe about 10:30, 11 o'clock through, and it lasts for the next few months. So you've got a good chance, hopefully, of seeing something quite interesting.
About an hour on either side of your local midnight is the best time to look. So you've about a 2-hour window.
Kind of neatly leads on to the next topic, which is Comet Swan. So Terry was saying about the dust from meteor impacts, etc. Obviously, we get meteor showers throughout the year. We get things like the Perseids, etc. August. These are all predominantly caused by the Earth intersecting with the dust tails of comets that are orbiting the sun, and they're an annual event. We were looking forward to quite a few good comets this year. I'm a big fan of comets. I've been imaging comets and doing a lot of science related to comets for years. And we had two comets which were looking earlier in the year really quite promising in Comet Atlas and Comet Swan. Comet Swan being detected by an amateur from some of the online images from the orbiting satellites, which are observing the sun all the time. You can do that. Anyone could do that again and detect what they call sun-grazing comets. It's something we were going to talk about at length, but it looks like it's actually gone pear-shaped, as we were discussing just before the show, Terry.
Yeah, comets are notoriously unpredictable. We can predict their orbits, and that's about all. The brightness and the sort of tail they develop, if any, and how long they last, we just don't know in advance. And the last two, both Atlas and Swan, unfortunately, have sort of fizzled out after looking rather promising. They just basically sometimes break up, and the outgassing that gives them the beautiful coma and tail becomes basically very subdued and dispersed, and they don't always live up to expectations. Occasionally we do get a beauty like Hyakutake or yes, the other one went out of my head. But as David Levy used to say, comets are like cats. They have tails and they do whatever they want, and these two just haven't sort of lived up to expectations.
I know you can still get a brief look at them if you've got a telescope. There's applications like Stellarium, sky charts, etc., which can show you where they are in the sky, and you could get a look at them, but they are really like disappearing quite quickly.
Yeah, binoculars.
Yeah,
even
we could do a whole show.
Barely show them, but telescope will.
We could do a whole show on comets. We probably will at some point. Anyway, moving on to the next item, Virgin Orbit and their launch anomaly that they had only in the last day or so, depending on when you're watching this, if you're watching it live or on YouTube. So Virgin Orbit have this plan to drop a 21-meter rocket from the underside of a repurposed 747 known as Cosmic Girl. And there's a plan for this in the UK. Spaceport Cornwall have got big plans, and it's moving really, really rapidly ahead with UK Space Agency backing to turn UK Airport into the potential first European horizontal launch site. Again, 747 will take off. Rocket will be strapped underneath the wing, very similar to the old X-15 from the 1950s, early 1960s, where you had a pilot in it, but this is non-piloted. This isn't the first time this approach has been done. Northrop Grumman have been doing this with the Pegasus, but it's the first time with a liquid-fueled rocket this has ever been attempted. Unfortunately, the rocket's Newton-free engine failed. There's still a whole raft of kind of tests and post-flight reports that are going to have to be put in. But I don't know what you think about this, Terry, but I'm really optimistic on this one moving forward. Obviously, the first one failed, but 50% of all first-time launches fail anyway.
Yeah, there's absolutely no reason why it won't work in principle, and the idea is sound, using a sort of a proven lifter like a 747 to get the rocket well up off the ground, you're saving a huge amount of fuel. Okay, one failure, but as you say, an awful lot of rockets. If you look back at the start of the American space program for a start, just about every rocket they had blew up either on the launch pad or very shortly afterwards. It was embarrassing. So I wouldn't be too worried about this. Yeah. And it's good to have a variety of different launch procedures and mechanisms and so on. And I've no doubt that they'll get it right eventually.
Yeah, should be a good one. Moving on to launch successes, moving on to the article I was briefly touching on before, which was the Soyuz launch. So these things are the most reliable launch vehicles pretty much ever, unless you want to go to Mars, that is. Russian launch vehicles, the Soyuz has been a staple now for, since the inception of the space age. Korolov's initial design really hasn't changed that much. And they've been doing fantastic work delivering both astronauts up to the ISS in recent years, but obviously other payloads as well. And Russia launched one of their Soyuz rockets quite recently, and launching a top secret military satellite. And it was supposed to kind of have the third stage come back in, re-enter the atmosphere and splash down into the Pacific, which it did. But apparently it left this absolutely spectacular file trail, which people in like Tasmania and Australia were observing quite brightly in the sky, shall we say.
Yeah, some of the best shows occur in the southern hemisphere. Unfortunately, they usually plan these things to land in the Pacific as the
Yeah.
largest ocean. So if you get a wee bit short or overshoot by a wee uh, maybe even a big bit, you're still going to come down on more or less on inhabited regions. But yeah, there's some really spectacular things. A lot of the orbits, unfortunately, don't come far enough north for us to see them in the UK because
Or
they aren't
fortunately.
originally in the sky. Well, yeah, I remember some of the big Russian stuff and American stuff coming down with fairly heavy bits of metal. But there's never
Well, that
been
was
one
it.
that, yeah,
There was one in Africa quite recently where, you know, something just crashed down into the middle of Africa. And obviously anyone who's old enough will remember Skylab hitting Australia
yeah.
in 1979. And it's not really what you want, having a load of space junk dumping on you. We'll probably
Well,
touch on that in future shows.
unless you can
Sell it on
recover it
eBay.
and flog it on eBay or whatever. It was the piece that fell in Canada, which was radioactive. And I think
Yes.
Russia is still paying Canada something for the cleanup of the radioactive
Yeah.
material that was deposited on Canadian territory.
That was the only part of Apollo 13 to survive, because when they came back using the lunar module and obviously the command module as lifeboats to get back from the moon with Apollo 13, they had to dump the lunar module basically into the Pacific Ocean. So somewhere at the bottom of the Tonga Trench in the Pacific is the radioactive thermonuclear generator, which was on Apollo 13. And they reckon that was probably the only piece that survived. So anyway, and then finally, just another astronomy related one. In the coming weeks, we've got some really nice planets in the sky. Obviously, the last few weeks, we've had Venus shining extremely brightly in the evening sky. Mercury's now taken over. And if you've got, again, a good set of binoculars, please be careful when you're looking anywhere near the sun with this. But Mercury is really nice at the moment. But I know two planets that everybody really loves looking at, Saturn and Jupiter, they're going to be prominent in the coming weeks, aren't they, Terry?
Yeah, they're quite close together at the moment. They both come to what we call opposition in July, and that is when they're closest to Earth and brightest. But because they move at different orbital speeds, they're actually going to separate very slightly between now and then. But if you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I shall not make any comments about whether you should or should not be up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you'll see two of these lovely bright planets together in the sky, roughly due south, fairly low down because they're in the southern part of the ecliptic. Saturn is about as bright as the brightest stars in the sky. Jupiter is much brighter. It's actually about 40 times brighter than Saturn because it's the biggest planet and it's about half the distance from Earth and half the distance from the sun, effectively, Saturn is. So it's very much brighter. And if you look out, as I say, in the early hours of the morning, you'll see them. In July, they'll be much better in terms of being closer and brighter and visible at a more reasonable hour. But if you're up early for whatever reason and the sky's clear and you look out to the south, you can't miss Jupiter. And Saturn is only about 5 degrees to its left, which is relatively close in the sky. But two very nice bright planets to have a look at. And if you have a pair of binoculars, you'll be able to see four of Jupiter's big Galilean moons orbiting around it. You very good binoculars, perhaps with him as stabilized ones or high power ones, you can just make out the rings of Saturn, but you really need a telescope to see that properly. But even if you have no instruments at all, just have a look out for those two beautiful bright planets.
It's really nice as well. You're saying about having a telescope. You don't even need a huge telescope to see the rings of Saturn. It's one of those things that Cassini obviously saw
Yeah.
400 odd years ago and saw the Cassini division, etc. It's a beautiful thing to see, just even with a modest telescope, looking
Yeah.
at Jupiter, and you see that kind of Everton mint striping with the clouds across it. If you've got a slightly larger telescope, you tend to see the Great Red Spot if it's in the right position, although that has got a bit smaller over the past few decades. Saturn is quite nice at the moment because its rings are quite wide open, so
Yeah.
it's well worth a look if you've got even a modest
Yeah.
telescope.
The number of times I've heard somebody say "wow" when they look at Saturn at the first time
Yeah.
through a telescope, and that includes myself, I must say. It is just incredibly beautiful. You see very, very nice photographs from expert photographers and from the spacecraft and so on. But see it yourself in what looks like 3D in the eyepiece. It's still just an absolutely beautiful experience.
It is, and even the moon at the moment. I was looking at the moon last night with my kids, and it's just stunning when it's that thin crescent, just coming out of new moon phase, and it's really, really beautiful to look at because you get so much shadow relief with the craters, etc. And it's one of those wonderful things to see if you've got a small pair of binoculars or a relatively modest telescope. Just have a look at the moon right now, because it is truly stunning to look at. And on that note, I just wanted to possibly hand back to our wonderful moderation team at Space Store and see if there's any questions for us.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much, Terry and Nick. I think that has been bang on time and absolutely amazing. I hope everyone on YouTube has thoroughly enjoyed that. And if you haven't been able to follow space news this week, that was your half an hour update of it all.
No, just say we'll hopefully see you again in about 2 weeks' time. We're going to try and do these every other week. This has been a kind of little bit of a test, so hopefully you have enjoyed it. I know Terry and I really enjoyed chatting, and we could go on for hours and hours. I know we could. It's one of those things that get us in a pub and a pint in our hands, and we probably will go on for hours and hours. But it's been really enjoyable, and just want to say thanks to the Space Store for hosting this and for bringing us to you. It's a great way to do STEM, great way to do outreach. Hopefully you've learned a little bit. Enjoy the launch, everybody, tomorrow. And in classic to Ronnie style, I'd like to say it's a good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Awesome, brilliant. Just a reminder that to tune in 2 weeks from now to see Terry and Nick again, and also a reminder to follow our talk on this happening this Thursday with a couple of space experts from Bryce Technology and OSS. And on Friday, we're actually having Space Store's live very first space quiz. So make sure you head over to our Facebook page and register for that with your family and friends. Until then, have a good evening. Have a good week, and let's hope tomorrow all goes well for the astronauts.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Good night, guys.